crowd falls and its roar. We'll remember the hogs back up yonder. We'll remember our friends forevermore. We'll remember Long Pond and its fishing. We'll remember Crow Falls and its roar. We'll remember the hogs back up yonder. We'll remember this camp forevermore.
The Long Pond Road. I mean, when was that? You know, the one that we ride now.
I imagine that originally Bible started for the logging. They used to there's a big tannery at Belfort there, and they used to use the bark for tanning hide stuff. And what they do, they take the hemlocks, what they use. They'd cut them off about 4 or 5 feet high. How they chop them, nobody knows. Then they'd cut them down. They'd take the bark. They have to do it in the spring when it's peeling. See, and they peel that bark off and pile it up, and dry it, and then in the wintertime they haul it up with teams of horses.
Seen some pictures.
And his one driver, he got sick, and they got me to drive him. I was only 15 or 16, just a young kid. So I got up in there and would leave about 4 o'clock in the morning, get up there daylight, just breaking daylight, and they'd load them all on by hand, roll them on by hand and stuff. And got it coming down, they used to, in the hills, they used to use sand and hay to hold the logs back. And of course, the roads wasn't too narrow. And they got it going down this one hill, and they got it pushing the horses. There's a little snow on the sand, it didn't hold so good, see. And the horses had to run for their life, and I was scared to death at that. Water tanks, sprinklers. There was a big tub on the sleighs, and they'd go along at night. Of course, that little time they could do it at night because the teams was drawn in the daytime, and they used to sprinkle that, see. And they had something like a snowplow on it, had blades on and stuff. They used to go along at night and level it off, and then they'd go through that sprinkler and sprinkle that, and it'd freeze, make just all ice road.
And so basically,
cut off pretty well. I've heard it tell about in the lumber camps how they didn't have any recreation at all. Of course, this is just a story that they had a fella died. And of course, in the wintertime it froze, they couldn't bury him. And they didn't come out because the tote teams are way back there was. And so the tote teams used to come in and out like that. So they froze him up. Now on Sundays, he used to stand him up in the snowbank, throw snowballs at him for recreation. Brother-in-law of mine, he used to have quite a lot to do with this, guided herds, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I guess he's probably 50, so of course that was old for me. But he took an old mowing machine. You seen the cast iron ones?
Yeah.
Where the wheels was, he put a drum on there. And he took the pitman, where the turns the blade, the pitman, he took that and put a crank onto it. And he put a big heavy rope on the drums, the blocked line. And he put that up on top there. And he cranked that building up that hill.
Both of them? How were they constructed?
I couldn't tell you. I think they just had clapboards and stuff on like that. I think they was logs before, some of them. Yeah.
And what was the name of the place when you were here?
Spofford's.
Spofford's?
Yeah.
What kind of? What was a little bit about him? Where was he from?
Well, he's a big multi-millionaire, I guess. He owned this whole section, and he lived in Utica, I believe. He used to come up once in a while, and he had different ones to take care of it for him here. Yeah.
What did they use these cabins for?
Well, had some people to come up here and stay. Yeah. The hotel wasn't really running too much when I was here. Yeah.
So just use those small cabins?
Yeah.
And did they have...
That was a Grant place before it was a Prentice house, and Mr. and Mrs. Prentice ran it for I don't know how many years, but quite a few years. And when Mr. Prentice died, he left a nice little bundle of money behind. $25,000 or $30,000 anyway. And he had a quite an attractive daughter, Esther. I don't know whether she's still alive yet or not. But she was very friendly with a lot of the people and a lot of the fellows particularly. And she got involved with a guy named Jim Mack. And they got married. And after Mr. Prentice died, he took over the whole deal. See, he was the boss. My dad was telling about going over there, and Jim was sitting there in the office of the hotel, and said, "Have a cigar, Pete." So Dad took a cigar. He said, "Hell, take the whole box." So the poor man wants myself. One of my dad's stories. He used to laugh about these. I thought to myself, "You damn fool, you're gonna be poor again if you keep this up." So, and he was. And Mrs. Prentice had $500 left. And one day my dad was over there, and she was crying. Of course, they were sort of friendly. And he said, "What's the problem, Mrs. Prentice?" And she said, "I had $500 left, and I had it hid under my pillow. And Jim, must have been Jim, sneaked in the night and stole it up under my pillow. I haven't got a darn thing left." That's a true story.
Now, that was a hotel also, right?
That was a hotel too, yeah. And it gradually, well, my dad bought it from Mrs. Prentice. Had a deal all made to buy it from Mrs. Prentice, and Spofford heard about it. And he went over and offered $500 more, and she sold it to him. She said, "Pete, I need the money." So he couldn't blame her. On the hill into the field there, and goes like this sort of, and it was right in that corner. There was a big barn over on the other side too.
So did they have?
And they had cottages there, and they had a big boathouse on the left as you go down to the beach. On the left, that little bay in there, that's where the boathouse used to be. A little kid, it had been after Spofford bought it, he just abandoned it. You know, it just gradually fell down, and the porcupines were, it chewed a hole through the floor and gotten in there. It was a mess, but it was still standing.
Was it about the size of this place?
No, it was more of a long, narrow building. And the porches were all off from there. It was a nice sight.
Road.
No, it used to come out right where the road goes into Dr. Woods' camp there. That was the original road. And then when they started hauling the bark down to Jordan, they went down to by where Paulie Gronert was down there, and that's when the road changed. Here above the bridge, he intended to put a dam there and divert the river down to Fish Creek to drive logs down to Beaver River. Did you know about that?
Yeah, and they cut a big swath there on that by the Pine Ridge camp there. They have a big area where they cut through. They were all ready to float them, and then I guess it stopped. They stopped the action, or if
they would have dammed it 8 or 10 feet high, it would have all the river went that other way. But they got the people down there. There was 2 or 3 mills down the river, see, and they got an injunction and made them stop.
About the cowboy that lived in Cowboy Beaver Meadow. Now, so I've been told that he carried a single shot Sharps rifle, and he carried the shells in his fingers like that. And they claim he could shoot almost as fast as a man could with a semi-automatic. And at one time, apparently, the law enforcement, I don't know who it was, but caught up with him at where the Woodrick Lodge is now. But they backed off when he came out on the porch, supposedly. But he had the Sharps rifle, and he always carried the shells in his fingers, and they claimed that he was very fast and very accurate. But he lived on the Cowboy Beaver Meadow for around 5 years, as far as I know. And all at once he just disappeared. Nobody knew where he came from, nobody knew where he went. He just came and he went.
Hemlocks. Now you know on the campground itself, we got some huge pines. And it's always sad for me to go in the woods, be near where the Gettman building is. In that woods, at that time, there were hemlock stumps. You could put an axe across, but they're bigger than an axe. They were over 3 feet across, and the logs are right there in the woods.
That's just the bark, right?
Yes. See, because back in those days, they were just harvesting the hemlock bark and floating it down to tanneries down on the Oswegatchie.
I read somewhere.
There was an old timer that I believe his name was Clarence Putnam. And Clarence was in his 90s at that time. And he used to drive to Syracuse to ball games. But we've talked with him, and he was the source of some of this early information that when that camp was first used, it was largely loggers as well as sportsmen. And when they'd play baseball, there'd be a bottle of whiskey on each base. One bagger, you got one drink. You hit 2 bases, a home run, you really had it. So also that lodge was laid out So no one of the early patrons had to be very far from a drink. That what we used to call the game room as you first went in.
Yeah.
They had a bar, but then they had a chute that the bottles could be slid into any of the other rooms. That no one need be very far from.
I found a lot of glass. We still have to warn the kids to wear their shoes because we find so much glass around there. Yeah.
Even when I was a kid, they had 20 or 25 boats here that they used to rent, and Spofford hired my older brother, to be the boat renter because he didn't live here. See, he told Bob that he'd split with him on the boats if the boat rental if he'd do the job. Because Bob was only 15, 16 years old, and the first time he accumulated $35, he went to Lava and bought a bicycle. And after that, he didn't have much interest in boats at all. You know. They had a caretaker here named Mr. Rich.
I've heard that name.
I can't remember his first name. Arthur Rich. He died here. He was resting his feet one morning and he just caved over in the bed. He was dead. Interesting situation there with his wife, Mrs. Rich, and my mother corresponded for years after Mr. Rich died. After he left here, as soon as he died, somebody notified Spofford. Spofford came right up. He went through the safe. The story is that the organization owed Rich a lot of money because they never paid him, or very little anyway, and it was just accumulating. And his records were in the safe. And when Spofford went through the safe, he said, "I had witnesses. My dad had witnesses to this. This is no good, and this is no good, and this is no good." He kept throwing stuff out. So they threw out everything that pertained to Rich. See, Mrs. Rich left here with nothing.
It seems that there was, from my end, as far as I know, that they had a problem when they tried to buy it with getting this clear title. I was told that Mr. Spofford hadn't paid his caretaker, so there was a lien against it. And the only way they got a clear title somehow through the state. But that's why it's called Spofford's Rocks, which still is, as you know, the hills are. But I don't know all that much about it. I know that the original road came in from the Prentice End. See, the Prentice End was settled first, for the Prentice houses. But other than that, I'm not really all that familiar with it. There's a lot of stories, and every one is different.
To go back, it was operated first as a sportsman's camp. Then a gentleman, Carl Spofford, bought the property, and he had built a camp right around, it would be the west side of the lake, just around the corner. There were two or three private camps. Mm-hmm. The first one was Carl Spofford's camp.
That's Steiner's. Okay.
And he had sold us the property. And he had operated it, he tried to operate it first as a hotel, then as a youth camp back in the 1920s, and gave it up. So the camp, that building was idle for just about 20 years. Wow. Between the time Spofford had it, and that all through the Depression years, and until we bought it.
Yeah, the question everybody asked, was a moose head in there? Where'd that come from?
Yes, Carl Spofford had shot that moose up in I think Nova Scotia some years before, and put it up there. And we took the camp with the furniture. It's all completely furnished for use.
Yeah.
But the kitchen, of course, had a huge wood burning stove that would take 3-foot wood. And I used to be kidded about it that in July you could cook anywhere in the kitchen. If you had a wood stove going enough to bake, and you had 3-foot wood in there, anywhere in the kitchen was warm. goes back to one of the basic philosophies of the camp. Basic discussion. You see, one group were all for the CCC type buildings. Another group, including me, wanted the campsites. And enough of the teachers had recently come out of the military where they had about all the barracks type camping they wanted anyway, and they kind of liked the idea. And also I thought we had this unique property with Long Pond, with all the points of land, that we could put 16 boys and an advisor out each one of these. And that would lend itself to the development of a program where it would not be superimposed on the boys, but they'd be putting out there 2 boys from each chapter, and to create a society, elect their officers, determine their program with certain guidelines, so many hours for leadership training, so many for camp improvement, and so on. And then they would work out their program and post that on the bulletin board. And briefly, how it operated, we talked about camping with every conference, and some of us were pushing the idea. And I said, particularly Sandy and Ethan were active. Then in, let's see, 1940, I guess it was, yeah, 1940, at the conference, they appointed a camp committee. And on this camp committee, I don't know if do you ever meet Jack Weaver?
Oh, yeah.
All right, but Jack he's a associate supervisor in state ed, and Ernie Noley, who was in Wolcott at that time, and Ethan Randall, of course, and myself. We were appointed as a committee to actually look up camp property. And at that time, we could have had any CCC, and so there's quite a strong odor, I imagine, of beer in that close truck. And it took us 2 hours to get into G Lake. But once we got in there, they give us a good feed and so on. But we looked at the G Lake property. But then along in April, Ken Kilpatrick from Lowville brought our attention to the Long Pond property. And he said we ought to really take a hard look at that property. And we had also been looking at properties on Pleasant Lake and other parts of the state. So that we then decided that we would present 2 properties at the Ag Teachers Conference, which is held in Morrisville in '46. We took all the group chairmen. We had about 40 in the group, and the board took them all up to G Lake. Then we took them all up to Long Pond and got their reaction to which camp they liked. And it was pretty close. But when in the board meeting held at Morrisville, it was decided that Long Pond was a property to buy. And I think it was they went to Lowville and closed the transaction on the purchase of the camp. It was interesting too because we were meeting quite a bit of opposition because of the high price. People were acquainted. Now this wasn't too far after the Depression, and the state had been buying land for $1 an acre. For example, most of the town of Brookfield is owned by the state now, as state land. And so here we were paying the tremendous price of $32,500, and we were only getting 1,000 acres and 2 hotels, 20 cabins, a boathouse, everything fully equipped,
Yeah.
and a lot of that prime timber.
Yeah.
So I had taken a lot of slides, and Jim Hatch thought we ought to make prompt use of the camp. So that August, Jim recruited a group and went up there for a week and operated a camp, living in the cabins and cooking on the old wood burning stove and so on, getting them most of their groceries out of Marillie's store.
Yeah, it was just that 1 week that first year, huh?
That's right. It's just that 1 week. Then they decided they needed a camp director. Well, it didn't take too long before they narrowed it down that I was the guy that really should be doing it. But I couldn't do that and also teach ag.
Yeah.
Well, at first they came up with the idea that they would give me the job teaching at West Leiden. Then I could teach ag and also keep track of the camp.
Yeah.
But I knew West Leiden and Tug Hill, and if I was going to teach ag, I still would rather teach ag in Moravia.
Yeah.
So after a lot of thought, they, Dr. Roy Olney of Cornell, head of the Ag Ed division there, came up with the idea that he would, they'd give me a graduate assistantship at Cornell, come back, work on my doctorate. As a camp, the vision was that we could teach leadership training in the learning by doing situation. The philosophy was that you really don't teach leadership by sitting kids in a class and talking to them. You have to provide leadership activities. That was basic philosophy of putting them out on these points of land. They had to take responsibility. See, one of the options they had was they could come into the main dining room or they could take their meals out and cook them. Now, if somebody neglected to get the salt, and he had to row a boat down the lake a mile and get the salt and come back a mile, you're quite impressed with the need of taking responsibility, even for a small thing. And the way it was structured, that they developed their own program. Then we had the regular class. Produced a radio program every week for WGY Schenectady, a tape program. For 10 years it had been my responsibility to do radio programs for WGY once a month. And so we could ship these down, and of course they were just audio tapes, but then
The actual facts was the camp was bought in 1946. That year Harold came and basically spent a week of closing the camp up. In 1947 he came for 2 weeks, and we had some beginning camping and really doing some clearing and some trailing. And in 1948 was our first full season. At that time we ran a full 5-week camp. And in 1949, which was my last year, we went 6 full weeks with the 1 week of Future Homemakers of America from New York State. And that was a very successful year.
I was a camper here in 1947 and 48, and then I came back as a man to go to town and get groceries and stuff. We had an old 32 panel job. You had to stop at every creek and pick up water and put in it. And one time I was coming home with a load of watermelons and the back door come open, so I sat down in the middle of Sand Hill. Of course it was sand then, and ate watermelons. I couldn't eat any more. Lost about 3 of them. Yeah. Yeah, and then I came back the next year as a assistant cook to Ben Wilson. Yeah, and then I was that for about 2 or 3 years. Ben was here for a couple years, and then Lou Bigsby was a cook, and I assisted with him for 1 year. And then I was a camp counselor for a year and helped build the Gettman Lodge. And I used to lead the music around the campfire too.
An old truck we had gotten surplus, I guess.
Yeah,
They called the Black Mariah.
Yeah.
It was enclosed, and Ruma used to drive that to town to get the groceries. In fact, before that, all the groceries came in I had an old Nash pulling a homemade trailer, and we'd go out to Murley's and get groceries. Because I remember one time at, they used to call the Sand Hill coming up,
Yeah.
and they had watermelons, and the watermelon had dropped off and smashed, and they had my 2 young sons, Hal and Dean, were small then,
Yeah.
and very philosophically they sat down and ate some watermelon before coming on into
Yeah.
camp. And later she drove the Black Mariah
Yeah.
in, because that time no one would deliver to us. Even our milk all had to come in from Murley's. They'd leave it in Murley's, then we started getting it in bottles. It'd be back in Murley's packed in ice. All the milk had to come in. It was to hire a cook, and usually we got a fraternity cook out of Cornell who'd come up there during the summer. Ben Wilson, I believe, was one of the last ones.
Yeah.
And Marv, I forget Marv's last name, I got a picture of him with holding a 4th of July cake, a great big cake. It was like a flag on it. And Lou Bixby was a cook up there. Then I hired a nurse. B. Bixby
Yeah.
was a nurse. Something May Lehman from over at Beaver Falls, who then, we had a maintenance person. Bill Sheldon did that several years as maintenance. Then we had, let's see, Charlie Klink.
I remember him.
Charlie Klink was industrial arts teacher
Yeah.
down Lafayette or someplace, and he came up there as maintenance. Then he fell in love with our nurse. Married her. Then last I know he was teaching up at Gouverneur.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And then we hired a waterfront person and a few assistants. Like, you remember Big George Tatman?
Yeah.
He came there first to help in the kitchen. Now George, at his best, weighed about 400 pounds. He's 6'2", he weighed about 400. And we could get him down to maybe 380, something like that. But everybody loved George. He was a great song leader for campfires. And later he became a great counselor, taking him on hikes. And of course, he could get the respect of any of them.
That size.
Just had a call from, talk about a voice out of the past, a boy by the name of Raymond Bandymark from Brookendale, was up there in the very early years. He was a student at Ithaca High School with John Mack. So that kind of dates him, you see. And he was up there several years. He was a great song leader, a great character, and doing work and setting up camp and taking campers on hikes and so on. Because sometimes each teacher would be assigned a campsite, but the campsite was made up of boys from up to 8 chapters. We tried to split them up rather than
you would have your own kids.
arguments both ways, But at that time they thought, well, we'll put 2 from each group out there together, and you won't have the gang spirit. They'll have to develop a identity of their own and play ball and everything as a team campsite rather than as a FFA chapter to carry that chapter competition.
Hands above your head. And I want you to say, Owa Tana Siam. When you know what you're saying, you can leave the circle of the camp. And I think I will leave that as my parting secret to all of the spirits of Oswegatchie. Amen. Oa Tana Siam.
Yay! All right. Well, I cheated. I know.
Water supply was a windmill, which I don't know if you've been there when the windmill was there.
It's still there.
It's still there.
It is?
Yeah.
Trees have grown up around it. So.
Oh, but the windmill was there, and we never saw so many windless days all summer as we'd been down. So we got first got a old surplus Wisconsin V4 engine and put down in the boathouse. Then we had to get the water chlorinator and everything to go with it, and go down and crank that whenever we want water. And right out of the kitchen door there was a water tank on a tower. Now the tower that water tank on was the original Bald Mountain Fire Tower.
Well, I see.
And that Bald Mountain Fire Tower, I believe, was the first in the state. After the big forest fires, I think in 1906, when the state put up this fire tower, then they put up a bigger tower up on Bald Mountain, so that one, the camp fell heir to that, or whoever owned the camp. So it itself. When we bought it, the camp had a 1,500 watt 4-cylinder Kohler generator. That was a sole power source. You couldn't have any bulb bigger than 25 watt in the camp and not have too many of those going. And the wiring was all knob and tube wiring. The modern wiring is put in largely by Ev Latimer and a team of ag teachers did the wiring, the new wiring in that camp. So when that gave out, Alfred Ag Tech had fallen heir to a lot of Army surplus, and they had a good Kohler the same size as ours. My wife Ruma went out with a car and the trailer to Alfred and picked up that one and put it in. Kilowatt, I believe. And we built that cement building side of the barn and put those 2 generators in that. And the idea of having 2 was that we could always cannibalize parts off one to keep one of them running. And that foolish thing never did have a self-starter on it. You still had to go in and crank that thing. But then we could have a power, but the power still went off at 9 o'clock at night. Now the little generator, you weren't sure of that. It might not run that long.
I can remember those days, that first one.
Behind you, and that brick cement.
Well, what was that, Bill? Because I have a photo of the barn you saw. It had the old barn shed, and then all of a sudden I pictured now that on. When was that?
Well, that must have been built in about 49 or so, because see, they had another generator in here, a small one, but it wouldn't hardly carry anything. Then they put in the walk-in cooler, so they had to have more power. So they put these big generators. They would light up a whole town. Those big Army generators. And that barn was the old barn. This is a new barn, right? Yeah. The old barn was just full of Army surplus. Everything Army surplus. You name it, it was in there. Bug repellent, pots, pans, canvases, anything. I mean, they give them to you back in them days, you know, from our World War II.
The limitation of electricity brought, we faced another problem. And you'll note in the old counselor's manual some chores that are rather unique. One was the ice house.
Yeah.
That during the winter we had Pete Yowsey and some other local people fill the ice house out of the lake. And then all summer, one of the chores the boys had to get out 1 or 2 big blocks of ice, saw them up into cubes, and put them into all the ice boxes. And for milk, we had picked up an old milk cooler. It was just a big tank that they put milk cans in and put blocks of ice to keep the milk cool. And to suddenly bring a group in that,
Sure.
with the wood burning stove, the lack of electricity, the lack of refrigeration, all those things been fine if you only had a dozen people in there, but when you suddenly bring in 100, then it's a different problem. And the refrigerator, the walk-in cooler, you may still have it.
Mhm.
Well, that was Army surplus. And I remember Julian Carter was a prime mover in getting that installed. They had it all trucked up there, but not necessarily all from the same unit when the Army got done with it. So parts didn't always exactly fit. And these were steel. And I remember Julian up there pounding and the other men making them fit. And then they still didn't have a door. Well, we found we could get a door. There used to be an Army surplus place down near Schenectady off Central Ave. So I went down with a trailer and brought that big door up, and the trailer wobbling all the way up. And the points of land, point of land down beyond Spofford's was
Loons?
I guess that's Loon Point, and the one across the lake from it. Yeah, there were early, and also the early sites. We in Army surplus, we fell heir to a whole bunch of Australian Army tents, and those were, remember, those were wide, but not very deep. And so we built tent platforms and put the Army tents on those, and that meant every fall they all had to be taken down, the cots and everything brought back and put up in the barn. Then Vale Sheldon, I think it was, suggested first we would enclose one of those on each campsite to use it as storage. Well, then the idea looked pretty good, so we used that, essentially that same format to build those little cabins out on the points, and then we could leave the cots and everything out there and avoid all that lugging every fall. Tried to involve the boys. Also the fact that we, these various chores or work experience things, as you see in the manual there, you may receive, we referred to the ball field as Boulder Field.
Yeah.
Because we had when we went there, that was brushland. There's small trees and brush because it had been abandoned for over 20 years. And so we had that all bulldozed up. Well, the process of bulldozing, a lot of the topsoil went too, and there wasn't very much topsoil to begin with. So we had all these round glacial stones in there.
They're still there. They're reappearing. But
there, we had several canoes where they had a little Indian on them, or a plowaw.
a couple left, I think.
There was Perry, Letchworth, Arcade, Wyoming and Warsaw, but anyway, it made the word plowaw. Though Wyoming County contributed several canoes. Of course, a prime mover there was Don Robinson and John Keller. And George worked too, but John worked on it first. But Don Robinson was a real pusher from Wyoming County. We had a lot of support there. The fact that the girls should have an opportunity. So we arranged with the home ec departments out of Cornell and in high schools to have the girls come up the first 2 weeks of the season.
Oh, I see.
Usually that was too early for farm boys to get up there.
Okay.
So we could open up camp earlier by having the 2 weeks of the girls up there. We did that for a number of years and pretty good attendance. And I used to kid about it.
But they did have group.
Oh yeah, the first 2 weeks.
FHA.
FHA, and then the boys came after that. Yeah.
Now, how did they do with bathrooms and how did they shower? Or how did they do for?
Well, just like because it was all girls. I mean, we were just counselors. I mean, I was just a counselor at that time. I was cooking. That's what I was doing.
Did they jump in the pond to clean up, or did they use bathtubs upstairs?
I think they had showers around. I'm not for sure. I can't remember.
Now you just had this main camp area, basically.
Yeah, but there was this one out here. What's this one called?
Sutliff.
Sutliff. Hemlock. Hemlock when I was here.
Okay.
And then we had Pioneer, and we had this one over Rock Pond. And that was about the only three I think we had when I was here.
To go back. It was it was July of 1952. I'm Donna Brennan. I was Donna Stahl at the time, and it was between my 9th grade and 10th grade. It was that summer, and we won this week to this wonderful camp. And when we came up that day, we were so excited. We got to camp, Judy started to cry, and she wanted to leave, and I said, no, we're staying. It's wonderful. It looks wonderful, but we were scared. We arrived here, by the way, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, wearing skirts and flats, as proper future homemakers of America would do.
And we have the picture.
In 1952. And it turned out to be the best week. We had a wonderful time. It was revealing in the sense we didn't know how crude and primitive it was going to be. There was no outdoor plumbing, at least not by my
Or
tents.
indoor either.
Or indoor, yeah, that's what we had outdoor toilets, not indoor plumbing. And no bathing. You had to wash in the lake and pump water out of a well. But you know what? It was wonderful, really.
We had the best week. We met a lot of people, and we had an awful good time.
We were, it was an experience, I'll tell you. Obviously, 44 years later, we had instant recall about the camp. When Judy called me, you're not going to believe it, there's going to be an outing at Camp Oswegatchie. I said, we're there.
That's fantastic. Now, who was the director when you were here?
I don't remember.
Harold
Georgia Marks was the woman, the FHA woman, but I don't know who the man was. And we never met a man. There was just women, except George Totman was here.
He was a kitchen worker.
And he worked in the kitchen, and there were no other men here at any time that we ever recall.
Yeah.
The camaraderie. We met a lot of people from a lot of different places, and it was fun to hear stories. And in 1952, you didn't get a lot of places, you know. So it was fun, and I lived out on the point out there, and I had to get in a boat to come back and forth for things. And I even brought one of my crafts.
Oh yeah,
that I never finished, by the way.
And the setting was beautiful. It's just beautiful. It's nature. It's at its finest. Oh yes, Judy.
I got photographs of these things. Yes.
I took mine home and I never finished it. 44 years, and I still don't have it finished.
Well, as an industrial arts teacher, you need to get back on that.
Judy still thinks she's going to finish it after 44.
So it's been in my scrapbook all those years.
You know what?
And that type of thing. And so we started building the lean-tos. Then the big project brought back to mind this summer, a few weeks ago when we had that terrible storm. And they all said the worst blowdown since 1950.
Yeah.
Well, 1950, I was at Oswegatchie. I've got a lot of pictures here I happened to run across of the tennis court area. You could walk across that without ever touching the ground.
Was that much?
We had some areas 85% blowdown. And we salvaged all but 2.5 acres. It was too remote. For example, Jay Manchester brought up a ag teacher in Waterville, brought up a small bulldozer. And we started getting out logs. And the idea came up, we ought to have an assembly hall. All we had was a living room in the main lodge.
Yeah.
So I drew up plans for one out at a school in Wyoming County. One winter, and I borrowed the ag teacher's drawing equipment. Based upon the building plans I had observed the Conservation Department had at Raybrook. That building is very similar to Raybrook. And I was going to use rough siding, and Ev Latimer suggested we really ought to use logs. Well, the blowdown solved the question. Right, here's our logs right here.
How about that?
And so we went ahead and started building what became known as Gettman Lodge. Building it was interesting because, again, our woodcraft, we had all these downed logs on all these points of land. And we go up there and cut them, skid them down to the lake, and try put them into big rafts. And I had a little 4-horsepower Lawson 4-cycle engine. Hooked that on a boat, hooked that to one of these rafts of log. A couple boys in the boat, half a dozen more on the raft. It'd probably take me an hour or two to get down the lake, and to get down to below where Gettman Lodge is.
Yes.
And then we didn't use tug of war up there. You simply put a hay rope tied to a log, 20 boys on the other end, and skid it up the bank up to Gettman, up where Gettman Lodge is. You see, that building is 35 by 70.
It's big, yeah.
And so those logs had to be at least about 37 feet long, and they were fair size. That lodge came out of the woods, except the floor. Now the base of floor in Gettman Lodge was the floor of the lodge at the other end of the lake.
South end.
At the south end of the lake.
Find this, yeah.
Yeah. And we gave that building to someone to tear it down if we could have some of the framing and the flooring. And that was 1.25 inch spruce flooring with caulk marks in it from the lumberjacks, because there had been a lumberjacks hotel down there. And that was put down. Then we found that Lehman and Zare, I believe it was, in Krogan, had cut a lot of cherry for a feed mill, and the feed mill didn't go through. They didn't want to build it. So they were stuck with all of this 1.25 inch cherry, which we bought quite reasonably. So that cherry floor was put down on top of the spruce, floor. Yeah. So you've got over close to 2.5 inches of flooring there, and the structure underneath were the beams from the old the camp at the other end of the lake. And you'll note that by looking around the fireplace that the floor is a little bit higher than the fireplace.
And Freddie Rice helped build that Gettman Lodge, you know. Did you ever get his name?
No.
He was a little guy about 5'2", and he was an old woodsman. He used to trap all the way across from this end of the wood all the way over to Tupper Lake, through the woods, trapping in the wintertime. And but he was a good log cabin builder, and he's the one that showed him how to build that building. Yeah, Freddie Rice.
He is very instrumental.
Yes.
Now, what was Harold Noakes like to work for? What kind of man was he?
Oh, Harold was a good guy. Yeah, he was.
Now, who else was there that was the FFA people that were instrumental about the first song?
Well, Julian Carter, of course, and J.O. Sanders. And then I was here in '54 when they had the dedication of the Gettman Lodge. I was here for that. I don't know, there isn't too much more.
What were some of the things that were different?
Well, the swimming area has changed. The swimming area used to be over on this side of the lake, the first point down there past that cottage. That was a swimming point. Now I see it's on this side of the lake. And then property.
Well, wasn't it a hurricane or something that came through?
Yeah, in '72, but that would have been after that.
It was an ice storm, windstorm, and there was a windfall.
It might have been.
Like we had here this last.
All I know is I was on the end of the rope pulling them up over the hill. I know that. Then the egg guy from Bolivar's, the one that built that. What was his name? That built the fireplace.
Oh,
I don't know. I can't think of it.
I know.
But he was from Bolivar. He was an old woodsman too. Yeah.
Past number of years, Camp Oswegatchie has changed an awful lot. My first experience was the summer of 1958. In 1958, as a rookie ag teacher, the veterans did the work and the rookies were the coolies. I well remember the first experience I had in building here was to help Don Watson build the chimney on Gettman. He was the mason and I was a stone person, stone and mud. About halfway through the week, it became apparent that they wanted to have a cabin instead of the tent platforms. And I believe it was Rivers. We went over and started to build a cabin so that we would have a permanent structure for campers to stay in. Another fond memory is the old barn. Leadership classes prior to the Gettman initiation were held in the upstairs of the old barn, which I think in the 60s was torn down and replaced. It was sometime in that time period.
I'm a teacher at Clymer now, but when I was a student in school, I was from Jasper Central School. And I first came to camp in 1952, the summer of '52, and I come up with four of us, 3 other members, myself, that come up on camper ships, and we got to stay all week at camp for free, but we had to do the dishes, all the dishes for the camp. And we got a canoe, and we got to stay out on the lake in the campsite, and we had a great time. One of the things I remember from the first year coming up here was that the sand road was much longer. It was all the way from Belfort into camp. Was all.
Oswegatchie camp in the middle 50s. That was the era of J.O. Sanders and Julian Carter. They were finishing up the Gettman building, and they were changing the campsites from tent platforms to permanent cabins. And they were doing a lot of work on Woodrick Lodge, the kitchen, and so on, because in other words, we were making the camp a more livable place and using less time in set up and taking down, which was with the tents. A lot of time was spent setting up and taking down.
New York, a little town, Wellsville, New York. Back at that time, it took us quite a lot longer to come up here. My ag teacher, I don't know whether he had wings on his car or what, but we used to really sail right along about 75, 80 mile an hour. And we would come up and work weekends and on Sutliff. And as I said before, my ag teacher was Julian Carter. He was instrumental in helping develop the camp. And when I mentioned the name of Julian Carter, everybody knows that he had a big part in developing Camp Oswegatchie. Paid $15, I think, the first year. Maybe it might have been $12. I think it was $12 the first year I came, and maybe the second or third year they upped it to $15, and we thought that they were choking us to death. But back then money was a little bit different. But Julian, he would go out and stump up a little money, or he would even one year I think he paid part of my fee to come to camp.
Used to be a haven for farm boys. And they really looked at this place as a place for a vacation, to play a lot of ball and sleep outside and have a chance to enjoy some fellowship and sprinkle in a little leadership.
My first experience of coming to Camp Oswegatchie as a beginning teacher, it was actually my third year of teaching, but they said that we were going up in the mountains of the Adirondacks to a camp, and I got up as far as Belfort Inn and hard road, and suddenly we were in sand that was worse than all the snow that I'd seen in Sullivan County where I taught. Car bogged down. It was like driving uphill against the wind. So it was a kind of a hectic trip, and I had one boy with me, and he kept saying, "Are we there yet?" And we kept going and going and going through this deep sand piles. So it was a real change to come up a year or so later and find a hard paved road almost all the way to camp. Teacher at Dryden, and he was chairman of the board and a mover as far as getting a lot of the improvements that we have at camp. If some of these fellows that first started where the teachers were the counselors and did all the work at camp, could come back and see the setup that we have now, they would really feel that their efforts in those days was well worth their time.
First impressions of Camp Oswegatchie was when I was a freshman in high school, when I came up here, were that this is much different than being home, because I lived out in the country and we had all kinds of trees around us, and but after I'd been here a week, I'd learned new friends and met a lot of people that I never would have met if I hadn't have came to Camp Oswegatchie. Things that are a lot different now. We didn't have any girls. Our camp nurse was a girl, and that was it. And that was the only female that was on the campus. There were 6 campsites, and there were 2 counselors per campsite. Some of the counselors' names I can remember were John Wood, Tom Oburn, Jim Eggleston, I think, was one of my counselors one year at the Bullfrogs. I liked walking so far that every year I'd sign up for the Bullfrogs when I got here. That was quite a ways down.
When I was a camper as a sophomore in high school, I was a member of the Canajoharie FFA chapter with Willard Dawson as our advisor, and that was before the color days. And he brought us up here to camp, and I camped first out at Pioneer Point, and Nate Brown was my camp counselor. And then the second year I came back, and that was the first year they hired college kids, and Nate was a great guy, but the college kids made more fun in the campsite. Our camp counselor had a boat, and he would take us to and from on his speedboat, and that was kind of neat.
Who was that?
I don't remember what his name was. That was in 1960. So
this was followed by the 60s, which were the building years, and that was when I first became involved on the camp board. A new boathouse went up, a sawmill, which was pushed by Ken Wells. Boathouse was pretty much Julian Carter's idea, and then about that time the old barn collapsed and the new one was put up the same year. This was an era when we had a lot of participation by teachers and students, so much work was done. All this work was done there without any professional help. And as it continued, at the end of the era, Sutliff was put in. Well, before Sutliff went in, the Hemlock campsite, which was at the where Sutliff is now, had to be moved. And this involved, we thought at first we could move them overland, but we measured the cabins, and there was no way you could get them moved without tearing apart and starting over new. So we got some barrels. We attached barrels to the side of the cabins, and we pulled them into the lake with a chief, and then we were paddle them around, and we'll pull them out at the present site of the Hemlock campsite that way. So we got 2 cabins moved. A third one was built there. So, and again, we had also built a lean-to there. Remember Al Chapin, Vogelthane, and some other people. We had a big time putting up the lean-to at the Hemlock campsite. Weekends, tremendous amounts of work was done on buildings, trails with no paid labor. A good example of this was the building of the Trout Lake campsite by Charlie Krause and the boys from Cayuga Bosse's, and it was complete with fireplaces, tables, and so on. Even though it wasn't never used much for campground, it still was a excellent facility that was done strictly by volunteer labor with the FFA. Executive director. So our first one hired was Gary Swan. His job was to raise funds and so on, and he was there for did that for a couple years. He was followed by Hartley Martin, who did quite a job on that. A lot of his effort was done into furnishing a Sutliff building. That Sutliff building, remember, we'd gone into debt quite a bit to build that building, and Hartley had to see that there was beds and dressers and stoves and all that, which he scoured all the surplus places around, and he got that furnished at a very reasonable cost.
Are here constructed, participated in the construction of Sutliff building. The Gettman building, of course, was built before my time. I started teaching in Central Square in 1948 and brought my students up here for weekend camping down at the far end of the lake at the Prentice Camp, which is now destroyed and moved up to this end, and we're using the timbers here and there. One summer, my whole family, except for my son, came up to Oswegatchie because I didn't happen to be working that summer, and they needed a maintenance man, and so I came up here and was the maintenance man on the staff, and stayed in the first cabin over here on the lane over towards Gettman. And my daughters have been on the staff here. Sue was an assistant cook one summer. Kathy was in the crafts cabin, and many of the things Oswegatchie is home for us. When we had our 50th wedding anniversary last year, we asked the kids where do they want to go for it. Oswegatchie. Nobody wanted to go anywhere else but Oswegatchie. It was during the time that I was chairman of the board, and then I finally became executive director of the foundation. What I remember most about Sutliff is my wife coming up here during Memorial Day weekends and washing windows and painting the trim on the window casings. But as far as its construction is concerned, this was done commercially. Not all of it was done by campers. The finishing of the interior, very much of it was done by campers. The installing of the paneling and the installing of the drop ceiling, the tiles, and that sort of thing.
State supervisor that was a supporter of camp, and if one of the pictures that is part of this video is of the camp board with R.C. Sutliff in the picture. has a building which is a dormitory and conference rooms and dining room. One of the all-weather facilities that we have at camp, which is used the year round.
Okay, Nate was, again, one of those people that was connected with camp way back. He was a treasurer and probably as good a man as we had there. He did a lot more than the treasurer work, became close to camp. Until we got a caretaker, he was the one that checked in groups and checked them out. And Nate, especially after I became chairman of the board, he was the guy I relied on because he would give you a straight answer. If you ask him a question, can we afford this? He would say yes or no. None of this mission on the book. He says we can't do it. He knew the finances, and he would work. It was up to every work weekend. He did a lot of hard, dirty work. I know when we were having trouble getting water for Sutliff, he spent a lot of time up there trying to get water, and it took us a long time to finally come up with a solution on that. But Nate was one of the people that I depended on. I think most people depended on, and he was.
My first recollection of Oswegatchie Camp was 37 years ago, coming into 9th grade. Harley Martin from Central Square was my ag teacher and brought, I think it was about 15 of us up, and things were a little rustic back then. They didn't have any electricity. The advisors stayed with us in the campground, and a lot of leadership, a lot of fun, a lot of hiking, and just a great bunch of guys. Late 60s, I came up as an advisor, and been coming every year with anywhere from 3 or 4 to as many as 10 students, and never lack for things to do, and never not have a good time. Sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate a little bit, but this is upstate New York, and if it's rainy, it's going to be sunny real soon. The kids always remember the claps of thunder that bounce around these mountains like, oh, it's incredible. They talk about that for a long time after they go home too, but the kids that never really want to come up always are crying on the last day when they want to go home. And that's the greatest thing about this place. They're reluctant to come, but once they hear, they never want to go home.
In connection with Camp Oswegatchie are some of the names who are synonymous with Camp Oswegatchie. Andy Lapine, for many, many years, was Mr. Camp Oswegatchie himself. And I well remember his camp songs and things of that nature, which led to an Oswegatchie experience. Francis Seacrest was another one, and Francis was certainly a dedicated camp person. All of these early ag teachers really loved the out of doors. And one of my favorite experiences is camping out with Andy or Francis or a group of ag teachers on Pine Ridge. And if you've not been to Pine Ridge, it is the most beautiful spot on camp property. It takes a while to get there, but it's worth the effort, and one really should, as we used to, spend at least one night on the pine needles, nature for your bed. And that's the way it should be.
Chris was my advisor in Afton, and he was secretary of the board at the time. He was very much involved with getting kids up here. And he would bring us up on Memorial Day weekend to open camp, which was when the mosquitoes were always the worst. Were you ever up here? Mosquitoes would be horrendous, and black flies. And we rapidly learned that you did not take an outside job, because the first year people would take an outside job and they would get eaten alive. And so we always took the job of waxing the floor in Gettman. You know, that was a nice. As far as coming up as a camper, it would have been in 8th grade, and which would have been in '64, I believe, summer of '64. And then I kept coming. Came 4 years as a camper, and at that time they had it set up that if you came for 4 years, you could come on as a counselor for that week, you know. And so actually the 4th year I came, I was a counselor. The Odells were the directors, and so I counseled out at Deer Point and had a great time. but got scared out of my wits because there was the assistant director was a guy named Mr. Randall, and he was a real stern guy. And I remember at one day at doing inspection, that was that week that I was there. He got up and reported that he had found a cigarette butt out around my cabin. And I thought, boy, I'm in trouble. You know, they're looking at me, and I'm in trouble. But survived it. And then came back as assistant director for a couple years under Al Lawrence.
Big Al.
Big Al, out of King Ferry. And then was assistant director for a year with the Martindales, Jim and Kathy Martindale. And that was a lot of fun. And then 2 years as director. So that was kind of the period. So I finished up here the summer of '76.
When I first came up as a camper in the early 70s, actually it was 1969 and 1970, I wasn't allowed to ride on the school bus with the boys that came up. I was the only girl. I was the first girl to take agriculture in high school. And my FFA advisor happened to be married to my English teacher, and the two of them would come up, and my English teacher would drive their personal station wagon, and I used to have to ride with her to come up to camp. It's kind of neat because she's now the president of the school board in the school that I teach in. So,
Where are they?
And they were Fran and Marge Seacrest. And one of the things about coming up with Marge is we got to check out Marilli and Company down in Krogan. Got to see an old oil slicker and got to go shopping with her at various places. Had to stay in Sutliff. We weren't allowed to sleep out in the campsites like the guys. So stayed in Sutliff 2 years. And then in the early 70s, they had more girls than they did guys. So they said, well, we'll let them stay out in campsites. And I was one of the first, and I think it's the only year we were allowed to stay out in a co-ed campsite. And that was unique. There was half guys and half girls at the campsite. I think it was out at Deer Point or one of the further campsites. And we behaved, and nobody got hurt that I know of. And it was interesting for most of the girls because we finally got to camp out in outside campsites.
The 70s, I think, was also a kind of a trying time. The Vietnam War was in its final chapter. People were kind of looking for things. They don't know what they were looking for because things were kind of crazy then. And I think some of the people that came to work here at camp were the people that were trying to get away, kind of the hippie style people, you know, the long haired and the beards and whatnot. And as I remember the year that I was director, I had over 150 applications just for the positions here at staff.
In the 70s was the advent of horses and trail bikes to Oswegatchie camp. Well, that sounds pretty simple. You buy horses, you buy bikes, but much more involved. There was no trails, a lot of streams at Oswegatchie, so that brought on an era of trail building.
I was a mini bike instructor for at least 1 year, maybe two, and that was kind of a crazy time. There was a lot of bruises and and marked up trees and bent handlebars, but once in a while a mini bike would go into the lake. But it was a lot of fun, and I know the board of directors, they kind of cringed, you know, when they were around because of the insurance and everything else. But it was just that era. It went from horseback riding to mini bikes to three-wheelers.
Brought on an era of trail building and bridge building. And eventually, most of the streams were bridged, and the trails were built around every pond we had. This was, again, a tremendous amount of work that was done by campers and the teachers. Probably the longest bridge was across the Narrows, a 50-foot bridge. In fact, that thing has been bridged any number of times. It was first one was an arch bridge, and we had a couple of A-frame bridges, and finally the present-day monstrosity, the suspension bridge.
I remember, I believe it was when I was a camper, maybe my last year as a camper, and we had Chief, which is a big Army surplus 4x4 vehicle, 4-wheel drive type thing. And I think we were all walking to Gettman, and it must have been on the Thursday night, watermelon night, or whatever night it was. We heard the chief coming down the road, and all of a sudden we heard a bunch of trees breaking and crashing, and right over in the woods over there, the guy driving the Jeep, the chief, lost control of it and crashed through the woods. Luckily nobody got hurt. That was always around here, which I loved, was the squirrel. I don't know where the squirrel is now.
Vicky Gregory, FFA teacher, they took exchange of the truck and they're renovating it.
They're renovating
Yeah.
it, so it's going to be an antique.
Yeah, it's going to be a classic.
Classic. But I remember one time when our refrigerating system went out here. I don't know if something failed or if the power went out or whatever, but we had just stocked it for the week. We had to load everything on the squirrel and take it to Krogan and put it in Krogan Meat Market's food lockers and Monnets and places like that. And so, you know, a vehicle like that kind of saved the day. You know, we got everything.
Okay, one of the first things that I remember about Oswegatchie Camp was my first summer here. George Allen, who later went on to become a state and national officer, was my first officer training back in 1968. He and his advisor, Bruce Emanuel, were my first trainers and really gave me a love for Oswegatchie Camp and made me want to come back year after year. And I was trying to think the other day of how many summers I've been here, and it's probably close to about 25 summers now I've been here. And when you total that up, that's about 1/2 year out of my life that I've spent at Oswegatchie Camp. Fascinating. In the 1970s at Oswegatchie Camp, we really had run out of all the promotional ideas that we had had from previous years. And somebody came up with the idea that we should perhaps have some sort of a slide sound presentation regarding the camp that we could pass around to the various chapters such that those who had never seen the camp could become familiar with it. I believe the project was underwritten by the Instructional Materials Service because I remember Darrell Foster being instrumental in helping to put the project together. And I was asked to put together a slide sound presentation at the time. We wrote a script, figuring that was step number one, and then after the script was written, we would put pictures with it and then find someone to record the voiceover. And while discussing the project with Darrell Foster, the way I remember it was, Darrell made an offhanded comment such as, wouldn't it be great if we had a cartoon character to narrate this whole film? And I made the comment, yeah, I think that would be wonderful, Darrell. And Bert the Bear at that moment was born. We took the slides, and Darrell arranged for someone in the College of Human Ecology at the time to put us in a studio and recorded Bert the Bear, and he became famous for all time. That slide sound presentation incidentally got a tremendous play because I believe it was rented out by the Instructional Materials Service, so any teacher in the state of New York who wanted to show Oswegatchie Camp to his classes in high school was able to do so very economically. It was a huge success, way beyond. The Cummins building brings back fond memories to me as well because most of the time state officer training was conducted in the Gettman Lodge. But I remember one year where we gave the Gettman Lodge away to some other youth groups who were here at the same time, and the FFA officers had an opportunity to use the Cummins building where I sit now. And I remember this is the absolute most beautiful place that you could ever have a class. And one year after I taught vocational agriculture for a couple of years, I brought a group up here for a conservation instruction class, and I remember specifically, even though it was the fall, we asked for the Cummins building, and we taught that class out here where we could overlook Rock Pond and see the rock and the trees in the distance. Absolutely beautiful location. It was a stroke of brilliance, the fathers of Oswegatchie Camp building the Cummins building here. And the only thing I regret is it seems to be one of the most underused buildings on the property.
Best I knew for years and years and years, yeah.
And what did he do for a living? I know he was a guide and he worked here as a forester.
Yeah, he worked for his father in a sugar bush, had a good big sugar bush. He used to call it the White Camps down there. Oh, where the log cabin is on the right, where they make that turn there, that was the White Camps. Ben Woodrick's father owned that there. That's the big sugar bush there. And Benny used to hunt mostly. He took care of it at Tide Lake. The camps there, there's a bunch of doctors and that stuff from, I don't know where they was from, cities. They used to come up there hunting. And Ben used to tote the stuff up. And
Now you mentioned Burke.
Ben came to us from the very beginning. Ben had pigs, and Ben used to come in every day and get all of our garbage for his pigs. Then later he came on in a more active role, putting on cookouts and stuff like that. But in the early days, he was just getting the garbage.
Impression on me, of course, one of the great ones is Ben Woodrick. Of course, this is one of the reasons that we now call our main dining hall Woodrick Hall. Ben was there from the start. He was there as one of these guys, a natural born teacher, whether he was teaching kids forestry or wildlife or caretaking, anything. Ben had a way about him where he'd get along with anybody. Kids took to him very readily. He had time for them, and he one of these guys. We were lucky to have had him as long as we had. I can remember the last
story of Ben Woodrick. Now, Ben, being our caretaker and a woodsman from the word go, was famous for taking people up into the woods and showing them some sights of nature. I well recall one time he took a group of ag teachers up to, I believe it was a Trails End camp, up past the high banks. And as we went up to Trails End, he was telling about the early logging experience of folks in this area. And it seems that they would cut logs all winter and roll them down to the high banks and tip them over the high banks until they had the big area, the big valley type structure full of logs. In the spring, they'd go and when the water came high, they'd loosen those logs up and float them down the river to the sawmill. And then in Ben's typically dry situation, he said, you know, many times when they'd release those logs, they'd come out in big cascades of logs, and loggers would get killed. Not at all uncommon to lose a logger. But in his dry voice, he'd say, you know, it's an awful chore burying a man. So they found it was a whole lot easier to just leave him on the porch overnight. When it got cold in the night, he'd stiffen right up and they'd take him out and drive him into the swamp with a post maul.
Leaning towards the trading post there, it had a little lean towards the trading post. It was a dangerous situation. Actually, there's two different trees here. There was that one there that was leaning towards the trading post, and Benny came in and we put a cable on it and dropped the tree towards the lake. But the real exciting one was the one right here in front of the honeymoon cabin. And that's the one that he dropped, headed right towards the building, but he calculated that it would not reach the building. And I remember the cook coming out and standing there in horror that this thing was coming right at him. But no harm was done. He dropped it exactly where he wanted. He put a stake out there and drop it right in.
It was a big crowd.
Another story that comes out of the Bert the Bear story was that I came to Oswegatchie camp to take slides of the camp such that they could be inserted into the script on Bert the Bear. And it rained that week at camp, so we were never really able to get the slides that we wanted to get on bright sunny days. But we kept thinking that one of the things I would do is when the seaplane came in, we'd take some aerial photos. Well, unbeknownst to us, the next day was going to be sunny, but the ag teachers that night decided to have a meeting down the road, which became a little later in duration than we thought it would. And I remember coming back to Oswegatchie camp and having breakfast in the kitchen at approximately 5:30 a.m. And that we thought would save us from getting up for breakfast the next day and gain us a little extra sleep based on our meeting the night before. But come to find out that the seaplane that day rolled in at 7:30 a.m., so we wound up taking pictures on an hour's of sleep after a night down the road at the Buckhorn. Most interesting.
Picture we were looking for, the beer cans, the pyramid. That time there was 13 campers, well, they were staff members, and they had 7 weeks, and their goal was to drink 1,000 cans of Budweiser. But there was only 12 of them drank. Now one of them drank Pepsi, and they couldn't count the Pepsi cans. And I gave them garbage bags every time they came down, and they kept their cans. And they were doing quite well, and they had them up set aside up on the dump of the landfill, whatever you want to call it. But somebody decided they needed some targets for the rifle range. And they took a bag or two of the bags of their cans, and they were using them because they were non-returnable at that time. So they lost count. I don't know, but they tried real hard.
That was always fun. I mean, somebody was mentioning to me the other day about playing the latrina. Now, latrina is a three-holer fixed with strings. It can be played like a guitar. And that was first brought to camp by Bruce Hilton, who had one. And it wasn't too much time before we went out and built one of our own out in the barn and used it on skit night. And as time went on, we'd add different things to it. Like I know one of the things we'd like to talk about is how you calibrate the holes. Like for example, small hole is the big hole is a marksman, then expert, and finally your expert rifleman. So the different things of this type were developed from that, and so we use that a lot. About the same time too, we developed different forms of bird calls, which always was well received. And also, it's when I developed my specialty, which was the Pine Ridge yell, which I'll give you an example. Now it goes something like this. That's a short version. The full version is kind of tough.
How about a Lighthall bird call?
Oh, yeah. Talk about interesting people you meet at camp. Probably one of the most enjoyable I've ever had there was Ray Lighthall, because especially he was usually working on a roof, and if you walk by, you were apt to get mooned.
To go out there, canoe out there, and we would spend the week out there, and your father would wake up in the morning and give horrendous calls to the wild, and quite often they'd be answered. And I never knew who Chloe was. It must be some flame in his background, because he'd get up in the morning and, Chloe! It's absolutely true. It's the only nude beach that I know of.
Did you say that Pine Ridge is a nude beach?
Oh yeah, your father would attest to that too. His morning, both testicles. And in the morning, his standard ritual would be to jump out of the bed and go down over the bank with the elk.
So why they call you Ray Moon Lighthall?
Well, that was a name your father gave me because he was against putting on roofs. We needed to do a roof on Sutliff. It was time, and one morning I told him we're going to start this roof. He was chairman of the board, and of course you had to have his approval. And I was on the roof already in a stooped over position with blue jeans on, and a person with my profile like this, you know, when you wear blue jeans, you expose certain regions of your body that shouldn't be seen by most other than your wife. And he came up the ladder and he got a full, probably a good half moon right in the eye. And so, therefore, henceforth came the name Ray Moon Lighthall. I think I blinded him because it really knocked him off base, and he approved the roof.
I don't really know where it came from. I really recall being here at camp, and somebody had seen this particular thing apparently and described it to me and wondered if I would give it a try. And so we went down by the waterfront and carried out a procedure that kind of was fun and that type of thing. And since that time, I guess probably there have been some changes made, but the basic tenets of the Booga Booga Walla Walla procedure still remain the same. I really don't know its origin. I do know that an awful lot of folks have done it. An awful lot of folks are members of this society, and it's been really a fun type part of our Oswegatchie experience.
The finer moments in Oswegatchie history for me would certainly be included when I was inducted into Ooga Booga Walla Walla. I came to camp, I think for the first time in 1985 as a first-year advisor, and was totally, I guess, confused, amazed, and actually almost scared about some of the things that were going on here. I was amazed to see that they would actually put people on trial and dump vast amounts of water over their heads, and I didn't realize that there was just such a specific way that you had to do this Oswegatchie highway and all this horn blasting, and it was really a culture unto itself. I guess my first week here, some of the great legends like Bob Robinson handed me a chainsaw and asked if I knew how to use one of these things, and at that point for 5 straight days we cut a tremendous amount of wood. I pretty much stayed quiet my first year. I didn't really have a whole lot to say, and then the next thing I know, we went down to the campfire area, and next thing I know, I was blindfolded up the air, and people kept saying about this Ooga Booga Walla Walla business. I was blindfolded, and they held me down in there, squirted vast amounts of water on me, and to be honest with me, I mean, I was pretty scared. Ooga Booga has got to be one of the most memorable experiences that I ever lived through here at camp. Todd was actually the master of ceremonies that night, covered in honey and sand and seaweed, and by the time it was all over, I had sand and honey and seaweed all over me, and of course a wet behind, and it was just simply one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had here at camp.
With my dad, who was an advisor, Dwight Putnam, and like Mo Lapine and like Todd Lighthall, we were all little kids and came up here and kind of lived in this place in the summertime as little kids. And then I came as a camper in 1973. It was in 8th grade, and I was here for 4 years, until 76 as a junior. And then the next year, let's see, I was a camper under Tim Cummins was the director then. And then the year Kevin Bemis was director, I didn't come up, and then the next year I came up here and just kind of hung out all the summer, and the director then was Bob Dowski. Being a worker under Bob Dowski, the years before, again, since I didn't really work here, it's hard to remember, but under Bob Dowski, I will say a couple of things. One is he definitely ran a camp that was efficient, very efficient, and he was very concerned with the surroundings, taking care of things, taking care of them and maintaining things, the buildings. I remember, gosh, I feel like I kind of lived in 55-gallon barrels of creosote. It seems like I remember at the end of every week we weren't done. We couldn't have time off on Friday until we had done jobs until 11 o'clock. We had actually creosoted or tarred roofs or dug ditches, and you always had to make sure the vehicles were parked. They had lines painted on the grass. You had to park them and wash them. I mean, it was very, very, very strict. But then again, he let us kind of be creative. So it was kind of a nice combination. And then, so for 2 years I was a counselor here, and then under Bob Dowski, and Bob Dowski's last year was 1980. Ron's year, who was director, and myself being assistant, we had some fairly large weeks. We had a couple that were high 100s, 180 and 170, 180. We had one that was so large that we had to have 10 or 11 campsites. So we had to have campsites in the Cummins building, and they had some in Sutliff, as I recall, and Loons, Pine Ridge. In fact, I'm going to kind of get ahead here, but that sort of, the next couple of years when I was director, that sort of gave us the incentive to build another campsite after that, because we realized that we had large weeks and the numbers were climbing. Really were climbing. And when I became director in 82, 83, and 84, we commissioned our staff to build another campsite at Beaver Point. I'll talk about that in a minute, but. No, our era. Yeah, our era, the 82 through 84, when you and I were together, was the Mo and Buzz show. Basically, we kind of just some of the things that we did, Mo. What were some of the things that you remember fondly that we kind of changed about camp?
The thing of Buzz and I, because I remember Buzz telling me he was hired as director and he wanted me as assistant director. As counselors, we had a lot of fun together. As Buzz mentioned about the staff, we just had people all about the same age, and we knew what camp was all about because we grew up there, but we also found Bob and Rudy. We knew what needed to be done to run a camp, but we also knew that we were younger, and we weren't the guys that were going to be up on our roof with a hammer or, splitting wood. That was Pat's job, and unlike the other directors before us, they were kind of more maintenance oriented. Buzz and I were being teachers. We were in education class, and we said we want to devote to the kids. And we really focused on that, and we had some great times. And I think with Buzz and I, one of the things I think most people remark is that we try to out loud each other. Right. Buzz would say, "Oh, there you go," I would yell louder and went back and forth, and it just became infectious. And we really focused the staff on to have as best time you could and to make sure the kids had a good time. And we started coining the phrase, which is funny because doing the interviews with the people earlier, they used to talk about the Oswegatchie spirit. And we coined the phrase Oswegatchie magic, and that sort of stuck. A moniker that's stuck on for years and years. It's something that I think people watch and they want to be part of, and it perpetuates and it gets better and better every year.
Exactly. And so now I think it's time for me to sign off and let Mo continue on, or Todd continue on.
And Roger, and
so I'd like to
onward.
Let's sign off.
A camper during the '80s during Mo's era. And I remember your crew very distinctly as being the counselors that I grew up with, per se. And then I was honored later on to become a counselor, and later on even director when they got really desperate. And that was I was director in '90 and counselor during '88 and '89. And that was the time that your crew was getting married and doing all those big decisions, buying houses and real cars, and I was just starting in. We had a nice tight group. We were starting fresh. There wasn't a lot of the old staff, but there were a lot of people that I worked with that knew the old staff. To the best of our abilities, we passed on to the people after us a lot of the things that you guys had started or passed on from before that. Yeah, from 46. There was a lot of us, and actually a lot of us that came up for this 50th anniversary that I was surprised I hadn't seen in a long time. Everyone in my group is married, they've got kids or just kids, and so it was good to see them, and I do my best to keep in touch and through the grapevine talk to the crew. We had a very unique crew because we started under Terry and Lois, the directors, in I think 87 and 88. Yeah. And that time, and 89 actually, their third year. It was a lot of fun. It was an honor to serve here. It was an honor for a lot of us, because a lot of us were state officers, not me, but campers. We knew all the old stories, the old skits. We had seen food in our hair and their hair, and we passed on all that onto the campers that we had at the time. And it's kind of even more of an honor to think back. I had one of my CITs was national officer, Liam Brody, and Todd was under me. He's now director and taking full tilt of camp. Some really important people that have made a drastic influence on camp and the FFA in New York State. I've worked with. It's kind of an honor, definitely.
Now the ropes.
That actually, the idea was passed along through the summer of '90, my summer as director, and before I left, I had the honor to go down to Beaver Camp and to experience what the ropes can do. We had a group and we had a tour. We were put through it. We didn't actually go through the program, but we watched another group go through it. And I was tagging behind. I saw a couple of kids on this obstacle course just built out of tires and string, rope. And they were suspended at intervals, and the idea was that the kids had to get from one end of the tires to the other end. But they were just far enough apart so they couldn't reach. And it was funny, I sat down, I was watching them go through it, and everyone's, they got, 3, 4, 5 minutes ahead of me doing something else. And I watched this kid. He got onto the rope with the tire, he was hanging onto the tire, and he was swinging out, and he got onto the next one, but then the tire behind him, the next guy couldn't reach. and he pushed off on it on accident. And he was swinging on the second one, and the other rope came out, and the kid grabbed it. And I could just see in his eyes that he suddenly realized the whole strategy of the whole obstacle.
And Roy Madison always came the week I came, and for a couple of years he kept saying, you know, the beaver camp has ropes, and that's the key to their success, and we should have ropes here. And I kept saying, what is ropes? And finally I says, ropes. Roy, I've heard you talk about ropes. Why don't you take us to see ropes? And so he did. He got myself and I think several other ag teachers, I think Glenn Osterhout and Vicky Gregory and Dick Campany, and we had a carload. I think Todd might have even went with us, and we went to see. And once we saw, we were convinced, yeah, we need ropes at our camp. And we saw it and we liked it. So at the next board meeting, we brought it up, and we didn't have a video or anything. We just talked about it, and the board voted almost a unanimous vote. I think there was one dissenting vote, and we pursued the ropes program. At the onset, it was going to be we knew it was going to be about $10,000, and the board voted to borrow the money and put the ropes in. And it was probably one of the easiest things we ever got past is when I was chairman. And I would say that it was a key to our future, and I'm glad we did it.
My affiliation at Oswegatchie back in the 60s when I was born. My father brought me up here as a kid, and I grew up, and one of my goals in life was to work here as a counselor, and I achieved that goal in the summer of 1989 when Terry and Lois Hughes hired me on as a counselor, and it was the best summer of my life, and I'll always look back on it with fond memories. And as I progressed up through the ranks, I got to become assistant director under Roger Barkman, and then I had the opportunity to become director, and throughout the years my position has built up to what has become a career for me. Fortunately, it's something I really enjoy, living here and working here full time as the camp administrator. Today, Oswegatchie, I believe I'd like to think that Oswegatchie has some of the same meaning and feeling that it did back in the 1940s when it was all put together by our forefathers as they are, or as they were, in that people come here for the same reasons. They come here to get away from the real world. They come here to meet people, gain an appreciation for nature, learn a little bit about themselves, become better leaders, things like that. And I think that's some of the goals that the people who dreamed this concept of a camp for FFA members wanted. And now that we are about to embark onto another century, while our missions are the same, our clientele has varied somewhat. We still cater to our FFA groups, and we like to pride ourselves in our FFA people that come, but we also depend on a lot of non-FFA groups now, and a big part of what Oswegatchie is the use of the facility by other people. And I think we should take pride in the fact that other people love what the FFA has and they want to take part in that. As we've had in the 90s is the development of better programs here at the camp so it can become a more well-rounded educational facility. We try to change our focus from that of camp to an encompassing educational philosophy. And over the years, throughout the years of the 90s, we've embraced that even more with the addition of our ropes course, which was talked about, the addition of a maple sugaring area for the purpose and use of bringing in kids to learn about the production of maple syrup and and its use as a product and a major agricultural resource of New York State. We've also added several programs to our summer activities to make the kids' activities more fun and get them to come back for new and exciting things. And then this year, in our 50th anniversary, we've had the fortune to add a climbing and rappelling tower in the name of John S. Gold. And John Gold was an outstanding supporter of FFA, grew up as an FFA member and had great FFA experiences, and through his adulthood life he continually supported us. And in 1987 he of course passed away, and over the last 3 years a total of almost $17,000 has been given to the foundation to help the endowment fund in his name, and then specifically this year $6,000 was given to the construction of a climbing and rappelling tower. And that is going to really take us into the next 50 years of Oswegatchie magic and just outstanding educational value of this property. I think so far our participants in that program this year have enjoyed it, and it's been just a great asset to have as a tool. That has had a place in many people's hearts for many, many years. Over the last 50 years, people have come to Oswegatchie and have just fallen in love with it. Back in the 40s, through our research, we found that, our forefathers, the people who created Oswegatchie, referred to Oswegatchie, the feeling that Oswegatchie gave them as the spirit of Oswegatchie. And I know in more recent history we've referred a lot to the Oswegatchie magic, and I think they're the same thing. They're two different words, two different phrases, but they mean the same thing. They're the phrases that are used to describe the feeling that people have when they come here and when they leave. It's hard to explain unless you come here and experience it for yourself. But as we embark on our next 50 years of history, I'd like to kind of combine the two phrases and call it the spirit of the Oswegatchie magic. And hopefully that spirit of the Oswegatchie magic will be something that many, many people will experience in the future for themselves and be something that continues for a long time.
On these shores 47 years ago, I came from Ithaca High School as a camp counselor at Harold Noakes. During that summer, we had 150 girls from FHA, Future Homemakers of America, who came to spend a glorious week. There was myself, Harold Noakes, and 2 cooks. That was the male environment at this camp. During that time, there was a young girl from Morrisville by the name of Betty Burleson, who chased me through the pine trees and across the flats. At this boathouse, which we are now sitting in front of, on the day that she was to go home, she cornered me. And I, being a young boy of 18 and very shy, tried to hide, but she found me. And there she gave me a kiss. But it wasn't a normal kiss. It's what the young kids today call a French kiss. And I've remembered it all these years. So last year, while passing through this area, I stopped in Morrisville and found that she was still kicking in Minnesota. So up there I went, and we renewed our second kiss 47 years later. I guess I can give her a kiss now. Are we on focus?
Yes, you are.
All right.
Remember Long Pond and its fishing. We'll remember Trout Falls and its roar. We'll remember the hogs back out yonder. We'll remember our friends forevermore. We'll remember Long Pond and its fishing. We'll remember Trout Falls and its roar. We'll remember the hogs back out yonder. We'll remember this camp forevermore.
Very good.
That's great. That was great. Yeah, definitely.